If you listen to the show, you already know that we cannot exist without our sponsors. They are the ones who make things happen behind the scenes. So let's acknowledge Fuji Sports. We've been working with these guys for a while now, not only as far as this podcast is concerned, but also at the RŌL Academy. We've had their gear. I personally use their gis. What a phenomenal product.
Yeah, I mean, Jiu-Jitsu, Judo, MMA, tape, bags, anything you need for your Jiu-Jitsu journey, you can find at fujisports.com.
Let's talk RŌL TV. There's so much content on there. It's ridiculous at this point. But I think what is even more intriguing, as time went on during the project, we've been recording most of the events that were taking place here at RŌL Academy. At this point, I mean, we have guys like Chris Howder, Armin Fati, Rafael Lovato Sr., and Pete the Greek. I mean, there were so many different events that we've kind of recorded it. Don't you think that's amazing? I mean, points of reflection and kind of going back for all the students to see what really happened and refresh their memory.
Yeah, I think it's great, you know, being able to go back and look at all these high-level practitioners, Octavio Cudo, like one of the names you didn't mention. And I mean, just these guys that have been doing this for so long come in, teach these amazing seminars and workshops, and it's all recorded and there for you to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want to get additional savings on all this, type in code RŌL Radio at the coupon and get additional 30% off of your membership.
Nice. Go to rolacademy.tv. What's up, everyone, and welcome back. If you haven't already, please remember to hit the like, share, subscribe, download, listen, and whatever other button there is, and leave us a review wherever you do listen. That ensures that we can continue bringing you the great guests and amazing content that you have come to expect. Our first guest of the new year has one of the most recognizable faces and nicknames in Jiu-Jitsu. A huge social media following, combined with a successful competition career and successful academy, have made Nick Chewy Albin one of the biggest names in BJJ. On today's episode, Nick discusses success, what it means to him and how that meaning has changed over the years, the profound way high school wrestling changed his life, the blending of grappling styles, the future of gi jiu-jitsu, and much more. Here's the RŌL Radio with the host of the Chewjitsu podcast, the Chewjitsu YouTube channel, owner and instructor at Derby City MMA, and a huge influence in modern jiu-jitsu, Nick Albin.
Welcome to RŌL Radio.
And we are live.
Yeah, here
All
we go.
right. The
What?
first official episode of the, well, it's the first guest of
Yeah.
the new year.
Mm-hmm.
2023 is here. 2.5 years later, we're still doing this. You didn't quit. You didn't quit yet.
Now, every time I think about quitting, I see that, not to toot our horn, but the stats go up a little bit. So it's like, oh, maybe I'll stick around a couple more episodes. So, yeah, I'm not going anywhere yet.
Well, that's good. And we are starting the new year with phenomenal guests.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Nick Albin, known as Chewy. Nick, let me ask you flat out. Are you the most popular YouTube jiu-jitsu personality out there?
I don't know. You know, I it's one of those things where it's kind of like you start doing what you're doing and you stop caring about really like sort of judging your, you know, like I don't know based on numbers. I don't know how you would judge popularity, but I really don't know where it is. I just know that I do what I do. And I seem to be well received in the community when I go out to like tournaments and stuff like that and gyms. It seems like it's made a positive impact. And so I kind of go off of that. I really don't care whether or not I'm the most popular or the least popular. I just kind of do what I'm doing. You know, it's kind of like when you train jiu-jitsu in the beginning, right? In the beginning, you do judge like how well you do versus some of the other people, because a lot of times you're trying to prove yourself to your own self. But then there eventually comes a point where you kind of get past all that silly stuff and you're like, okay, I'm just doing this because I want to do this. And if I'm bad some days, I'm good some days, who cares? I'm just going to keep training jiu-jitsu. It's kind of the same with the videos and stuff. Like, I enjoy doing them and I do them because I want to. And so at a certain point, it kind of got to the point where I no longer really judged like, well, how's this YouTube channel doing versus me or anything like that. I was like, I just do it because I want to do it. And that kind of thing. So I don't know if I'm the most popular. I'm definitely probably up there somewhere, but where I am, I don't know.
Yeah, and honestly, I mean, on a much smaller scale, we were doing the same thing 2 years ago when we started these conversations with different people, and like first few months it was like how many, and now we even just recorded kind of a recap of last year, and
unless I want to quit, I don't look.
We really don't look at it. So it is interesting how our mind changes and how perspective changes, and it's I think it's very similar to goal setting too, and we often talk about this versus focusing on the result, which would be those numbers. You just do because you love what you do. And often jiu-jitsu has the similar presentation, if you will. At times at the beginning, we focus on these things like submissions or, achieving those specific goals. Or this guy is better than me. We started together. He has one extra stripe, or maybe he got promoted here. But the longer we go through it, we kind of put that aside. It's more about the grind. It's more about the journey. It's more about, just being on the mat. Would you agree with that?
Sure. I mean, I remember when I was young. Here's a great example. Recently, I just did the 2022 Worlds, right? So like Nogi Worlds or whatever, which to some is like a good, I won gold. So which to some is a good accomplishment. And I won the gold medal, and I'm happy about it. Like, I'm glad I won, because obviously winning feels a lot better than losing. But I remember in a younger time, like, I would have been so jazzed up about having that stupid gold medal. I would have rocked it. I would have taken a bunch of pictures with it, whatever. And like now, like, I like having the memories of like the matches. I like being on the mats during the matches when you're going like 100%. I like being able to maybe inspire my students and stuff like that. But like me being able to like hold around a clunky gold medal really doesn't have the same sort of allure that it did when I was younger, because there's no need at some point to like have to validate myself to myself or what I'm doing. It's like, I've already done that for years. Now I'm doing this because I just enjoy doing it, and I get these cool memories from it. I get to like, test myself, and that's kind of fun in itself, and sometimes I win, sometimes I lose, and it's like, it's whatever. And so, even on that stage where winning a medal used to be this really exciting thing, I would wear the medal around like the whole day. Now it's like, all right, I got my medal, take my picture, let's throw this sucker in the gym bag, and it'll go hang up on the wall somewhere at the gym, and that's it. So
at which point that changed for you? Do you have one pivot point where you truly stop caring about some of these milestones or goals and really focus more on the grind, on the journey, on the work?
I mean, I always enjoyed the grind of it. I always enjoyed that. Like with training, like for instance, with people that get funny about belts or stripes, I never really cared about belts or stripes. I enjoyed training. And that was that. I just enjoyed coming to the gym. Now I still wanted to do better, and I would try to beat everybody in the gym. And I was like the classic white belt who would come into the gym, and it was like the world championship round every round.
Yeah, does that sound familiar?
Yeah, it does. Right.
I was that dude till like blue belt, late blue belt, so it is what it is. And a lot of us, we, depending on the time period you started in, a lot of us came up in gyms that sort of facilitated that, because it was just these hard, rough nosed gyms where you would just go hard. As far as like I guess you would say the pressure was off, there was no like one moment. I think there was a few moments that kind of came together where you're like looking around at some of the things that you've done with this thing that you're involved in, and you're like, well, like, at least for me, I was like, well, I've built up a successful gym, and, we've got 400 students or something. I've got this YouTube channel thing that was going pretty well at the time. And I was like, okay. And then I've got like some medals and stuff like that I won that I was like, I was pretty satisfied with. They were medals where when I was younger, I had thought about wanting to win those. And I'm like, I've done this stuff. And so at some point you're like, okay, well, like, at no point am I ever going to be like fully satisfied with achievement. I'm always going to want a little bit more. But I've at least gotten to a point where for myself, I'm like, I feel pretty confident, like that I've done pretty well by myself. I've like a lot of us, especially as at least, I don't know, I can't speak for women, but I know as young men, we go through life and we go on these little adventures and these journeys in part to sort of like prove ourselves. In a older tribal society or something, we would have had to do some initiation passage, right? Yeah. Right. And we had to prove ourselves to be a man to our society. in society today, we don't know. Like, what does it mean to be a man? Who the hell knows anymore, right? And so we go on these little adventures to, I think, in some cases, to prove our worth to ourselves, and also prove our worth to those around us, to say, look, I'm good at something. Look at me. And so, at least for me, I got to a point where I could look around at all this stuff, and both to people around me and to myself, I could say, you know what, I'm good at something. I've achieved something worthwhile. And so now everything else is just like kind of like a bonus. Let's go have fun with this. And it was interesting because once I got to that point and there was no pressure, everything like exponentially got better as far as like my mindset with things, but also like a lot of times in my performances on the mats and stuff like that, when there's no pressure on to win, like, and you can just go after things with almost a reckless abandon or a carefree attitude, it really allows you to open up a sort of a different door to yourself.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting how, if we knew what we know now, how different we would be 10 years ago? If what I mean by that, when we are starting jiu-jitsu, particularly, especially as a white, perhaps, fresh blue belt, there is still this urge of, proving yourself, comparing to the guy next to you. Yet sometime around purple, brown, perhaps black, different for different people, but we kind of stop caring about that. And it's exactly what you talk about, right? It's like we open the next level, we open the next door, and it's like, now I just don't care about that. And everything just gets different. It gets better. The different opportunities create themselves. How would we look if we had the same outlook from the very, very beginning?
I don't think you can do that, because the way that you learn those lessons is it's not transmitted through language, right? Like, we can talk about it all day long, and we can understand and nod our head and say that makes sense. But to actually feel that on a deep visceral level, you have to come to that yourself. And so you have to learn those lessons through a form of communication or understanding that has nothing to do with us being able to just speak it out in language. And so I think that's the issue, right? So like, if we could take ourselves now and make ourselves like brand new white belts, and somehow you'd have that, I mean, you would be amazingly so much better than what you were originally. But the problem is that until you've had that point of like going through that process, that you go through, that we all go through, unless you kind of go through that most of the time, like, you don't understand it on the other end. And so I think it's like one of those things where we were like, because I think about the same thing. I'm like, man, what if I could go back and I knew what I knew now? But I'm like, if I went back, and unless it was me now going back, I wouldn't understand what I was trying to, like, I wouldn't really understand that lesson back then, because it was all that crap that you had to go through to actually understand the lesson, which kind of brings up the thing about, like, a lot of times, which is something you learn from jiu-jitsu as well, right? Like, we have lots of failures, lots of mess ups.
Yeah.
We do lots of stuff. We bang our head against the wall. And at the time, it seems like it's bad. But then later on, it sort of falls into place when you look back on it. You're like, man, I'm kind of glad that bad thing actually happened, right? I'm glad that I was doing stupid stuff, because it made me find a better path later on.
Yeah, I think people always say, like, if you could go back and what would you tell your 18-year-old self? People have brought that up here, and it's like, I wouldn't have listened. I would not have. It could have been me somehow talking to my 18-year-old self, and I would not have listened. I would have said, no, my path will be different, whatever. And it's the same way in jiu-jitsu, I think. And even, it doesn't matter if you start when you're 20 or if you start when you're 40, you still have to have these internal struggles in order to continue on your journey and have it turn into a good one.
So essentially what we all saying at this point is that we need all these failures in order for us to get better. We just can't see that at a point in time when it's happening.
Mm-hmm. Pretty much.
Yeah, it's hard to reconcile that, I think, for a lot of people. You know,
I just last night I had a private lesson with a student, and he made an observation. He asked me a question. It was, how come you didn't tell me? He's been training for 2.5 years. I was like, how come you didn't tell me this? Whatever, long ago. How come? If I knew this, well, I was like, would you listen to me 2.5 years? I literally made a comment. Like, yeah, probably not. Probably
right.
Not. We're not ready for that.
Yeah, we a lot of times we have to be ready for the information, because you can think about the information like a lesson is almost like a seed, right? Like when it's planted, it grows into something. Yeah. But that that soil has to be tilled first. And a lot of times if, like you said, if like you guys are talking about 18, you wouldn't listen. Well, you're 18, you're very hard, right? You're like, I'll figure this out on my own. I got it, whatever your mindset is, that soil's very hard and that seed's not going to take root. But then if something happens that sort of gets you to reconsider your thoughts, it's almost like, plowing that field and getting that dirt to loosen up a little bit. And then when the seed comes in, you're ready for the information, right? Because it's like, I've told my students lessons before. I remember this in particular with one of my purple belts. I had told him something before multiple times, and then when he was a purple belt, for some reason it stuck. I remember I told him in his eye, he like hit a light bulb on me. You could watch his eyes light up, like I just got something new there. And I remember like thinking, I've shared this with you multiple times over the last several years, but for whatever reason now it's stuck. And so a lot of times we're not actually, the information's only valuable to us when we are in a state that's ready to receive it.
Yeah, and that's the beautiful part about jiu-jitsu. Not only we are different humans, we have different brains, different way of thinking, different personalities. We have different body types. But then on top of all this, the circumstances we are surrounded by are very different based on a person. So that journey is almost unique to every single individual. And so going back to the beginning of this conversation, could this be one of the reasons why we shouldn't compare ourselves to somebody else?
Well, I think the journeys are unique, but very similar, right? There's a lot of times it's like there's a difference. There's a sort of like overarching few ideas that are pretty much the same. But then some of the specifics are different. You can compare this to like a lot of times like story mythology. You can take mythologies from different parts of the world that have been shared over and over again, like whatever parts of the world you want to get into. This is like Joseph Campbell's work. And you can look at them and they have these basic overarching ideas that are all the same, but then the way that those particular regions may sort of interpret those or bring images for those particular things, that changes. So like, yeah, the specifics are kind of different, but the overarching idea of the thing is very similar, right? Like, you think about about most of the people that come into the gym, there's a reason why we can have these truisms, if you will, about like not comparing yourself, because we know you're going to compare yourself and there's like almost nothing you can do about it. You have to go through it and you have to realize what a futile effort it is, right? Because most people, not everybody, but most people do it. Most people come in and it's how humans, it's how we do things anyway. We all look at each other and we compare ourselves to other people. And it's only at a certain point that we say, maybe I shouldn't do this. This isn't very useful to me. I mean, think about like think about school. I mean, I remember as a kid, we would compare everything to our classmates. And then once you get out of that experience, you're like, well, that was not useful at all. And then if you have kids, you're telling your kids, listen, don't do that. But they're going to do it.
They're going to do it anyway.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Talk about, if we can change it up a little bit, talk about you as a child a little, because I know you got into wrestling in high school, and maybe for specific reasons, and how that helped you change who you were, or at least how other people perceived you. And I don't know if you want to touch on that a little bit about where you started in grappling and martial arts.
Sure. I got started in wrestling. So it's interesting. So I think, this is my thought, I think the reason I got into wrestling was because when I was in 7th grade, I was walking home from school one day. I got dropped off on the bus and I was walking home from school, and I saw these guys behind me and I didn't really know what was going on, but I looked, mind you, at this point, I guess I'm 12, right? I look behind me and I see these guys and they're older than me. So I don't really think much of it, but I get some weird feeling. And a lot of us know what that is. And we get like little spidey sense going. And so I start walking a little faster because I don't know, something feels weird. I'm only a block from my house. I just need to speed it up a little bit and I'll be fine. So I get close to my house. I look behind me, they're speeding up too. And they're kind of gaining ground on me. I'm like, that's kind of weird. So then I kind of jog a little bit. I look behind me, they're jogging too. Very strange. And for whatever reason, maybe about 4 or 5 houses down from my home, I just turned and looked at them and they're right on me at this point. I said, hey, what's up? And one of the guys, bam, punched me. He was 16 years old, punched me in the face. One of them had a bat. hit me. I had I luckily did this. I did like Taekwondo for like a year, you know, and I did my high block, which I think is probably just a gut human reaction. And the bat hit there and hit my arm and had like a big swelling there. And my neighbor came out and chased him off, but I got jumped. And, you know, my nose was broken. And, you know, worse than that was like this lack of physical confidence. And I remember at this point in my life, I went from being a young guy and I was always running around and riding bikes and stuff to being very reclusive, staying inside. And I started gaining a lot of weight. And when I got to high school, I had no physical confidence. I was super chunky and overweight. And for whatever reason, I remember they were doing signups for the wrestling team. And so I signed up because I was like, I don't know why, this just sounds like something I would want to do. So I signed up for the wrestling team. But when when they called us down to like, you know, like later on that week, they're like, if you sign up for the wrestling team, come down to the cafeteria to meet the coach, whatever. I was too scared to do it. And so I didn't go. And then I remember the next year, wrestling signups happened again. I wanted to do it. And I got one of my buddies to do it with me. And so we both signed up for the wrestling team and we started doing that. And it was instantly when I got into it, it was like awesome. I don't know what it was about it, but I just felt like I kind of liked it. I was good at it. I also liked being in a group of other men where we were all together and we were, you know, it was such an interesting thing because just like we talk about jiu-jitsu where you get this wide sort of mixture of people, wrestling was very similar at the time where you had the cool kids, the nerdy kids like me, you had like everything in between. And we were all training and wrestling and we became like brothers during those periods of time. And I got pretty good at wrestling and it gave me confidence. I lost weight. I felt physically strong again. And so from there, when high school was over, I didn't want to stop doing that, you know, because in high school, basically I was kind of depressed sometimes during the year because I couldn't wrestle and I wanted to wrestle, wanted to be with the guys. And then during wrestling season, my grades would go up. My overall sense of well-being was up. Everything was, all measures of life felt better. And then when it would go down, I would go back to normal. And then, so when I got out of high school, I mean, actually before I was out of high school, like my senior year, I started looking up jiu-jitsu gyms in the area, which there weren't many, but I found a guy that was teaching jiu-jitsu at a powerhouse gym, like a weightlifting gym, and we would put down the puzzle mats, and then we would train. And so I found that guy at the end of my senior year of high school. And so while everybody else was like out doing senior parties and stuff like that, I started doing jiu-jitsu, and that I got started back in 2003. Like after that, because, and again, it was, as soon as I walked in, it was the same feeling as wrestling. You know, like I felt like I was basically we're bullshitting a little bit before training. And then we would just, you know, learn some techniques, roll with each other, wrestle with each other, go live. And it was fun. It was a good time. So I got sucked in.
Did you convert into gi immediately after wrestling, or there was a no gi transition?
No, we didn't have that choice. I mean, back then it was, most of the training was gi. So my first class was no gi, which was, we used to do no gi on Fridays, but the rest of the week was gi. And so, I mean, I actually, believe it or not, I bought a gi before I even started jiu-jitsu. So I remember I bought a gi, bought my no-gi gear because I was just like, I'm going to do this. And so I had a gi, I had Valley Tudo shorts and a rash guard. I didn't have a rash guard, I had a t-shirt because rash guards really weren't that popular back then. And I had the t-shirt. I was like ready to go. I was like ready to go before I had started jiu-jitsu, because as soon as I got in there, I wanted to have everything ready to go. And I knew that I needed one. And so, yeah.
At which point do you find out about jiu-jitsu? At which point do you learn what jiu-jitsu is? Because it appears like when you start doing it, you already knew what it was. You were searching for it. You were hunting it. At which point you're learning what this jiu-jitsu art is?
Well, I mean, just like many people of my generation, we grew up watching Hoist in the early UFCs. And then, you know, MMA went into kind of that dark period where it kind of vanished for a while. And I remember when I got into wrestling, it then like somehow like, you know, wrestling was going on. And it was around this time that the UFC got bought by Zuffa, and they were starting to they were starting to grow. And all of a sudden you started to hear about them again. Yeah. And I was like, oh man, the UFC is still going on. So then I started getting into the UFC, which then led me to Pride. And then all of a sudden there's this whole MMA universe that I didn't know about. And then you quickly realize that one, wrestling is good, and that if you have jiu-jitsu, you can finish people. And that was like, at the time when I was in high school, that was like the big issue. You'd have a guy like a Mark Coleman or a Mark Curry, these amazing wrestlers, but they couldn't finish anybody. Like they should have been taking people down. And if they had like good purple belt level jiu-jitsu, they should have been just submitting everybody with kimuras or something. I mean, it should have been like done like that. And so for me watching it, it was like, okay, so I like wrestling, so I need to continue wrestling, but I really need to learn jiu-jitsu because that's how it's going to finish people. The one thing that was a really tough transition for me was that early on, I didn't want to learn the guard. I just wanted to learn all the top submissions.
That sounds familiar.
I'm laughing because we had a recent influx of wrestlers coming in here, and it's like daily conversation. So,
that was one of my problems early on. I was like, okay, I want to learn how to do the top submissions, and from guard, I'll just kick them away and stand back up. Not sort of taking into account that I was like a mildly good high school wrestler in Kentucky, which is not a heavy wrestling state. So like very quickly I was like learning that, oh, I'm not going to be able to out wrestle everybody. And then also when I learned how to play the guard, I also learned that like, well, if I know how the guard works, I can beat the guard better because I know what they're doing down there, opposed to if I don't learn what they're doing, then I have no clue what's going on down there and I'm a sitting duck.
All right. Let me ask you, I'm going to put you on a spot.
Sure.
Let me let me ask you the $1 million question: wrestling versus jiu-jitsu.
How do we mean wrestling versus jiu-jitsu?
I don't know.
Like if you take pure wrestling, pure jiu-jitsu, they have no real knowledge of each other. Jiu-jitsu wins. Yeah. I mean that's already been proven plenty of times.
So let's pivot off of that. So how come if we take that approach that jiu-jitsu is more technical and has, you know, I guess superior approach to wrestling when you compare 1-to-1 without cross knowledge, how come wrestling is so popular and so strong?
Well, I think so. Here's what we have to think about. So it's not so much like that. It's not a technical thing, like, because again, like wrestling is incredibly technical.
Yep.
The techniques have a different end purpose. So like like when you get into wrestling, whether it's folk or freestyle or whatever, there's a different end purpose. Our main purpose in wrestling is to take the person down and gain back exposure. That is the focus. If we can gain back exposure and either pin the person or take them down, that's what we're doing. Jiu-jitsu is a little bit different in the tempo is different. Wrestling obviously is more fast-paced and explosive. Jiu-jitsu tends to be, it has those explosive moments, but it has a little bit more of an undulating sort of tempo where you have to be very tight in positions. But the end result is to finish someone with a submission or to be able to like kill them or maim them, right? I mean, so like from a fighting standpoint, it is superior if you took them as one-on-one. Now, if the goal was to like take someone down and pin them, jiu-jitsu will not hold a candle to wrestling.
Correct.
It's just the way it is. And it's just like, and then you take judo. If like, as an example, judo is another like grappling sport. If the goal is to throw someone from a fairly upright standing position and land them on their back, I mean, there's nothing that's going to outdo judo. I mean, because that's what those sports have become really highly focused on. Now, what happens is when you take wrestling and you take the gifts that wrestling has, like the ability to scramble, the hard-nosed grit that you gain from that, and then you start to sprinkle in some jiu-jitsu in there, you instantly become a much more dangerous grappler pretty quickly. And because there's fewer of them in jiu-jitsu, a lot of people don't have the luxury of training with a high-level college athlete who is a wrestler in their gym, and so they don't know how to deal with it when they first run into it.
So, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but what you're saying is that individually they have different rules of engagement. As a result of that, it puts them in the buckets, if you will, different rooms. However, the moment you open the doors and start bleeding in between all three of those, because you mentioned judo too, now you become extremely dangerous because you have these multiple skills that would be isolated in their own environments.
And then also because we're all jiu-jitsu guys here. When you take one of these people that come from one of these, let's say judo or wrestling, one of these other disciplines, or even sambo, I've dealt with this before, and you take them from one of these other grappling disciplines, and then you bring them into our sport of jiu-jitsu, they feel different, right? Like when you roll with them, like, and you've been around for a long time, you understand this. If you roll with a wrestler, you roll with a sambo guy, you roll with a guy who is like an MMA type grappler, you can roll with him for about like 10 seconds and you instantly have a feeling, oh, like you engage differently. And the thing about that is that you don't have a lot of those running around. And so that throws people for a loop. And so if you roll with those people long enough, you will figure them out. But early on, like if you've never had the the pleasure of rolling with a like D1 wrestler who starts learning jiu-jitsu, and all of a sudden you have to roll in with one in a competition or even just in your gym, it is going to throw your game for a loop until you roll with that person a bunch and figure them out and understand how to use your technique versus them. And so I think that a lot of times people will say, well, wrestling's better than the jiu-jitsu. Look at what the wrestlers do in jiu-jitsu, that kind of thing. But I think it's that, well, there's just not as many like really awesome wrestlers in jiu-jitsu yet. And as more and more of them pour into the sport, you'll see that they can become equalized and can be beaten with different means as people understand how to deal with them and that sort of thing.
Do you think that's one of the reasons why wrestlers are, and I'm going to be careful with the word I'm using here, but frowned upon when they come into jiu-jitsu at the very beginning, yet as time goes on, we really appreciate them because they bring the change of dynamic into what truly jiu-jitsu is. Do you see what I'm trying to ask?
How do you mean that they're frowned upon?
Well, okay, so we have let's frame this. So let's frame this in, right? So we have a typical jiu-jitsu class, right? And you have a D1 wrestler coming in. The dynamic is, you mentioned yourself a moment ago, right? The dynamic is going to be completely different. Right, they're going to engage in different way. The dynamic, the pressures will be different. The speed will be completely different. The angles will be completely different. Right. Often that introduces, quote unquote, chaos in a class or in a sparring session. Oh, he's a wrestler. It throws a curveballs constantly. Right, until we can figure it out. And like watching over decades of these situations occurring on the mat. Oftentimes, people don't want to train with wrestler for the very first time, very first week, very first month. And then as time goes on, they're like, okay, I can learn something here. There is something new. There's something different. Let me see if we can incorporate this. But this first initial approach often is kind of reserved, not frowned upon.
Sure. So, I mean, that just comes down to the fact that people don't like to lose.
Absolutely.
And that's really what that comes down to. So, I mean, but the reality is it's like anything else. Oftentimes the places where we stumble, the places where we struggle are the places where we get better. Right. And so when you roll with that wrestler, that D1 wrestler or whatever, or, I've got, like, for instance, in my gym, I've got a guy, he's a 3-time NAIA national champion, and he's a stud. He'll go out and out wrestle guys that, from bigger schools or whatever all the time. He's very, very good. Now he's so tough to deal with, and he was tough to deal with when he came in. Luckily he was ready to learn jiu-jitsu right from the get-go, and he was trying to play leg locks and stuff, which, again, the guy learning how to do jiu-jitsu really fast, like, that creates its own problems. But yeah, I mean, there are times where people could maybe be reserved depending on the person. Like, if you get a wrestler who's also in there with the mindset of, I want to win every round, which sometimes happens, and it can be kind of dangerous for them to roll with, say, smaller people if they're a bigger guy or whatever. There's something to consider. But if you get a wrestler that comes in and they are understanding of the idea that this is training, and they're not and they're still trying to do better and win, but they're not trying to kill the person below them or whenever they take them down or whatever, then, I mean, it really comes down to the person then is just, they just don't want to lose. And so they just want to, like, sort of go with an easier role. When in reality, that role right there would probably be the best one for them. Again, the exceptions to that are, again, if you have a wrestler who's like hell on wheels and maybe injuring people, or maybe you're a bit of an older grappler and you can't take certain levels of punishment from younger people. Sometimes that's a reality. But assuming that you've got a good young, healthy body, or relatively young, healthy body, and you've got a wrestler that a lot of times people just don't like rolling with them because it presents a new problem. And, it's easier just to go with what's normal and comfortable.
I think for, like, you mentioned older, and I think for me, at least, it's like, give those guys a couple months here and then I'm happy. Like, I'm happy because it's like the rules of engage, they understand the rules of engagement a little bit better. How many of those guys have gone with somebody who's 30 years older than them, right? Things like that. Once they start, the knowledge of what happens in the academy starts opening up to them, and they start accepting it. And it doesn't take that long, but then it's like, all right, I'm ready for him, I guess, not, he's not ready for me. And maybe he is, right? He's older. He's ready for the older guy. He's ready for the smaller guy. So that he's not doing those dangerous types of things you were just talking about.
Well, sure. You've got a guy that's like basically coming forged out of a fiery hot like program of like a wrestling room, right?
Yeah.
And then they come into a gym where like, let's say jiu-jitsu, like where you may have those really tough competition training sessions on some days, but then like for most of us, the average day will have a myriad of different types of people.
Yeah.
And some of those people they can't withstand that kind of punishment, especially coming from like an early 20s, mid 20s, or even someone that's in their 30s. I've had a 30-year-old D1 wrestler who was like a All-American, he was a monster. And I had to like get him to settle down, because when it would become time to roll, it was like cockroaches when the lights turned on, and they would run away from him. They didn't want anything to do with them. And so, it took a while for him to settle down a little bit and realize that, in wrestling, you're like, here's an example. In a lot of wrestling programs, you don't go live every day. You drill. On some days, you might do some situational work. And on some days, then you will go live. And those live sessions are so hard and intense, and you're trying to win every round. And when your nervous system is wired that way, that takes a little bit to undo that to a certain degree and say, okay, I can train and I don't have to go 1,000% all the time. It just takes a little bit of sort of rewiring. And like you said, that can take some months.
And fundamentally, if you compare both of the sports, wrestling and jiu-jitsu would be the one that's a little bit more passive, versus wrestling it's very offensive, it's very attack, everything is, and you never get on the back. So just by circumstances and rules of engagement, it makes it very go, versus in jiu-jitsu, we are more accepting. Me being on my back, life is good. Please put me on my back. Let me see what I can do from the bottom. So just by nature of that situation, it changes the dynamics, how each of them is approached mentally, right? From engagement perspective.
Sure. Because one, you have the idea where you can give up position. You can also like going to your back. Things are a little bit more precarious if you go rushing into them, because you can get caught in submissions and things like that. And even the rules, like when you think about competitions and things like that, competitions in jiu-jitsu stalling calls, they're a joke. Guys can dance around, they can back up, they can all do all sorts of stuff. And it's so hard to get a stalling call in jiu-jitsu that is really significant. They'll get a couple stalling calls, then you start getting negative points. And it's insane. In wrestling, if you take a step back, you might get a stalling call because you're going backwards. You can circle, but you should always be going forward. And the rules have been adjusted to make sure that a lot of times to certain things that would allow you to slow things down, like certain grips and things like that, once you're on the ground, have been removed, or you get penalized for them. And what this does, this allows constant motion and action. And so, in a wrestling match, right, for instance, in high school wrestling, you have like 6-minute matches, 3 2-minute periods. You're just going the whole time. Whereas in jiu-jitsu, it's much more of you slowly set up your technique. You go fast for the execution of the technique. And then once you establish the next position, you stop for a moment. You lock onto position, you hold, right? And then you slowly set up the next thing. You go for the attack, whatever, and then you hold. And it's this constant sort of building up and then pausing, building up and then pausing. Whereas wrestling, it's basically you're constantly at a steady pace, and then you have these moments of explosive action.
Do you think that as these other arts, or other sports, or wrestling, judo, and a handful of other sambo, and just even no-gi grappling, as they merge together, because that's what they are doing. They have been doing for a couple decades now, but it's more visible in the recent times as they bleed over and we cross-train, learn these other things. Do you think that this whole thing will become one no-gi sport at some point, with, and I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but perhaps wrestling disappearing as a traditional wrestling, and this grappling appearing? Or maybe wrestling will suck this grappling into it and it will become a little bit more evolved. Do you see any of this to changing to that point? This might not be yet next year or 5 years, but I'm talking about out in the future, where you and I might be in the wheelchairs and kind of hanging in the bleachers, watching this whole thing.
I don't think so. I think that you have these rich traditions in all these different sports, and people like being in their different sports. It's like, boxing, there's lots of guys that just like doing boxing. And then there's guys that like doing kickboxing. And then there's guys like doing MMA. There's people that love wrestling. They grew up on wrestling, and wrestling is what they love doing. And the idea of going to their back or anything, they don't want anything to do with it. Then they've got people that are like, obviously they come from judo and they wear the kimono and they do it forever. And then in jiu-jitsu, we have our own thing. I think this is kind of one of the reasons why I enjoy the fact that jiu-jitsu is not an Olympic sport. Yeah. Because if jiu-jitsu became an Olympic sport, it would become far more like there would be like canonized techniques, because you would have, like, for instance, the IJF. And in the IJF, back in like the 80s or whatever, these Russians come over from Sambo. They're using all these unorthodox grips. They didn't like it. They banned the grips. Yeah. Okay, so we get rid of that. Then you had the Eastern Europeans that were coming in doing double legs, like Paul Nastulia. They're doing double legs, taking people down. No, we don't like that. Get rid of that. You can't attack the legs anymore. Yeah, now you have to stand up. You can't even double hand grip break. You have to stand up, and you got to throw each other. Yeah. Now that's okay, but that's what they want, right? So with jiu-jitsu, it's like we have so many different variations. Like we've got EBI rules, IBJJF, we have ADCC, we have this myriad of different ways of expressing jiu-jitsu. And I like that, because then that allows us to be essentially technique mercenaries. We get to basically say, I'm going to take some wrestling, I'm going to take some judo, give me some sambo. I'll take whatever we can get to use in this sort of place, because we have very few rules that govern like what we can and can't do, aside from a few things. And I like that. And I think that allows us to be very like, it allows the sport to grow as far as technique very rapidly, because we don't have some canon of techniques that we have to memorize, because this is the only way that it's practiced, because that's what the Olympics, the special committee or whatever that says we're supposed to do. And so I don't see that ever happening, because I think that, each sport is going to continuously grow. I don't see them kind of converging, because obviously it's like kickboxing, boxing, and MMA and wrestling. Obviously, MMA, it represents one expression of those arts combined together, but you get people that find their niche in one or the other, and they want nothing to do with the other ones. And again, this is just how that works. Once we find our little niche in our little place in the world, we're like, this is what we like to do. You go do what you want to do, but we're good here, and this is what we want to do for now. And I think you'll have plus wrestling, especially with wrestling, you have such rich traditions in all these different countries, from Russia and Iran, the United States, all these different places have such rich wrestling traditions. They're not just going to go away. You know what I mean? They're going to like, no, we like what we're doing. You guys do what you want to do.
I hope you're right. I do enjoy myself, the diversity of jiu-jitsu, the guys coming in with wrestling, with judo, with sambo, and just evolution of that sport as is continue going. So I hope that continues. I hope we're not going to be as limited as what you're talking about, some of these sports, especially once they enter that Olympic domain, that things become. I mean, listen, from the flip side, the growth of the sport, once it enters the Olympic domain, it's tremendous. I mean, you put it on the international top level layer. At the same time, you do have to play by those rules. And then I think some of that delusion kind of fogging of the sport begins at that point. So I hope you're right. We shall see as time goes on.
Real quick, taking all that into consideration, where's the gi going?
Oh,
I think people like to make predictions, because predictions are inherently entertaining.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
I'm making I mean, look at the guy who he's on like one of those like one of those channels like MSNBC or whatever, the guy that picks stocks. He's incredibly wrong all the time. Like I think there's a guy on like on Twitter who's like, I just pick the opposite of whatever he says and I do pretty well, he's telling you to buy the stock, but people still watch the dude. And so predictions are fun, right? They're just inherently entertaining, and most people don't really care if they're wrong, because they'll be so distracted by something else if it is wrong. So I've seen all the things, the gi's going away, the gi's not going to beat. I doubt it. Yeah. I mean, like obviously what's happening right now is you're having more and more focus being put on the no-gi for big competitions. Yeah. So obviously you're going to get a lot of focus for those competitions. And a lot of focus, from people is going to go towards that realm, because that's where you have more money being put in. That's where you have more notoriety being put in, more, everything that you can measure is going into that. but I don't think the gi is going to go anywhere because I think there's always going to be this traditionalism. And I think also people like the gi. You know, a lot of people enjoy rolling in the gi. I still like rolling in the gi. It's not I don't like rolling in it as much because it kind of hurts me a little bit more than no gi does. I can roll more in no gi. It wears me out more, but I can roll more in no gi than I can in the gi. Whereas in the gi, a lot of times if I roll a ton in the gi, it's like I feel like my hands get stiffer and like people are yanking on my collar and stuff. But I still like it. And so I think that people will probably always roll in the gi in some level. But again, this kind of goes back to where does the focus go? And so again, a lot of the focus is going into the no-gi tournaments. So that's what people are focusing on. And so that's where you're going to get more people sort of that its presence will become bigger than maybe what it even really is, because that's just what you're seeing all the time. But I don't think the gi is going anywhere.
I hope not.
I'll be in trouble.
Well, just the fact that you're saying "I hope not" tells you it's not going anywhere, right? It's
Right.
Like,
Well,
there's
no,
tons
listen, I mean, we all, kind of making fun of this and looking at this very casually, but, the reality is that no-gi is more entertaining. I mean, there's no beating around the bush. It's by far more entertaining. There's more action. It's more slippery. All that creates point of entertainment, stimulating visually for the viewer, right? Gi is by far, and I don't want to use technical here, but there is more nuances. There's a lot going on just with the fabric and the grips and so on, which makes it slower, which makes it less entertaining. And that's, I think, a big factor why no gi is more visible today, because entertainment drives money. Money drives compensation. These guys want to get paid, and they should get paid. At the same time, there's this whole demographic of guys, I would say 40 and up, if not 35 and up, who want to train safely and slower. They don't want to get destroyed. They don't want to get hurt in the first class because it's a survival room, and I think that is catering towards the guys who will continue doing gi, who will engage into gi versus no gi. Would you agree?
Maybe. So let's talk about the idea of entertaining. So a lot of times we'll say that it is more entertaining, and maybe as a general rule, it probably is because it is more fast paced. But for instance, the ADCC championships, there were a ton of snoozers there. I mean, basically it's two guys hand fighting, locking up, not really going for anything, and basically just winning on refs decisions. And then you can watch matches where you can have, let's say, one of my favorite matches of all time in jiu-jitsu, you got Rodolfo Vieira versus Buchecha 2012. That match was it was just nonstop action. I think that if you want the sport of gi to be more exciting, ultimately what you have to do is you have to start getting into more nuanced rules, and you got to start saying, hey, listen, if you get this stupid friggin' lapel wrapped around this person's body, and you got X amount of you got a shot clock. We got to do something with it. And if you don't do it, we're just going to break the action, reset. Let's start again. Because what happens is you get into these, or let's say you get into 50-50 in the gi where you can't heel hook and you can do almost nothing with it. All right, you've got 30 seconds and then we're breaking this up. Because again, I've seen some of these matches where you're excited about these matches. You're like, this is going to be the best. And then they somehow get tangled up in the position and you're like, shit, this is awful. And then, whereas if you could say, okay, let's break the action and let's restart again. I think you could make the gi, I think, more entertaining with certain rules like that, where you basically, when you get into these positions that become stalling and they slow things down to the point where you're going to be stuck here for 2 or 3 minutes. Let's break the action and let's restart. And also the time limits are too damn long, right? Why do we need a 10-minute match? Why do you need a 20-minute match? They're too long. And
because they are all tangled up.
Right. But even in the ADCC, you have 20-minute matches. For what purpose? Why do we need 20-minute matches? That means that basically that person has to spread their energy over the course of 20 minutes, and they've got to pace themselves. And every competitor knows that if you've got this long to go, you've got to make adjustments, because if you try to go for the kill too early and you run out of gas, you're going to be in a bad place. So what do? You spread it out a little bit. You pace yourself. Whereas if you say, hey, listen, you've got 7 minutes. 7 minutes to go hard. Every high level grappler, young guy can go 7 minutes, no problem. I think you would have more exciting matches than making the matches incredibly long. Cause I think basically all that does is create more passivity and guys where they just sit and do nothing. And I think it's a weird thing. Cause like you look at Olympic wrestling, like wrestling starts off at 6 minutes in high school. It doesn't go to 20 minutes in the Olympics. They just say, go faster. Right. And it's like you basically have close to the same time. Go faster. It doesn't have to be 20 minutes. You don't have to keep extending this time. That's a very unique jiu-jitsu thing where we keep extending this time long. Even in boxing, boxing, the rounds go to a certain point. You get a few more rounds and stuff like that. But it's not like we say, okay, guys, in amateur boxing, we're going to do, 2-minute rounds or whatever. And we'll do 3 of them. Okay, well, now you're doing a professional boxing match. We're going to extend that to 7-minute boxing rounds. And we're going to, they just say, look, we're going to add a few more rounds, but roughly it's not that big of a deal. So
yeah, and in our lifetime, it's gone down in boxing. When I was a kid, it was championship fights 15. Were 15 rounds.
Yeah,
now you're down to 12.
Yeah. So
and sometimes for certain fights they'll do even less.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And I think you have more energy. So
it's interesting how all this evolves, especially if you stick around for a long time, a decade or two. You can really see that evolution.
Mm-hmm.
What would be the big thing that you've noticed over last couple of decades as you've been active on the mat? That has changed within jiu-jitsu. If you had to pinpoint 1 or 2 things that really was black and white between then and now.
Well, obviously leg locks, that was a big one. Leg locks have become a thing where you have leg locks. Now, if you're talking about are you talking about the technical aspects or something else?
Either or. I mean, it's just, what was the big, if you look at jiu-jitsu when you stepped on the mat the first month, 2, 3, versus jiu-jitsu today. Compare them side to side. Technically, community-wise, even from a mental approach, anything.
Sure.
Altogether.
Oh, there's so many. But yeah, right. There's a lot. So looking back at when I first started, for instance, when I started, we'll go into basic down to the classroom setting. There were no beginner classes. When I came in, it was sink or swim. You get fed to the wolves and let's see if you stick.
Yep.
And then now it's when I have guys come in, they will start in the beginner classes and they will roll from the first day, but the rolling will be very situational rolling. It's okay, I just showed you how to do this. Let's stick you in this position. And this is the only place you're going to play around in right now because I want you to roll, but I don't want you to hurt yourself. So we're going to roll here. Whereas back in the day, we'd be going, I got put in a knee bar my very first day. Now, luckily, I had watched a bunch of MMA and I kind of knew what a knee bar was, but first submission I ever got put in a knee bar. And so, you think about that, you think about just the way that we train people has very much improved in a lot of cases, not everywhere, but in a lot of cases has improved a ton. I know my students have a far better experience of getting brought in. And when I mean better experience, I mean, as far as bringing them and making them better faster than what it was back when I first started. You have the sort of proliferation of information through the internet. I mean, back when I first started, you actually had to buy DVDs. You actually had to buy them and they would come in the mail and you'd put them in your thing. And I remember me and my buddy used to watch them on in my room, and we had a mat. I bought a mat for the bedroom. So this way we could practice techniques that we were drilling, but we had to do that there in the front of the TV. Now you got the internet. You can just look up whatever you want. You can buy streaming stuff. You can buy instructionals from whoever you want. Instantly we used to, if you wanted to learn most of the information, you had to go to seminars and actually learn from the person in the flesh, which was sometimes difficult. And, those are some of those technical things. The competitions have gotten so much more popular. Back in the day, you have a competition once every so often in the area, especially in the Midwest. And California is probably a little bit different out there, but out in the Midwest, you had a competition once every month or two, no big deal. And, a lot of times we were traveling for, 9-10 hours just to get to a tournament,
I remember that.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many things. It's just, you've got so many more people. The one thing also too, and I guess the last thing I'll kind of go back to the leg locks thing is now you have leg locks it's not just leg locks. It's more of an openness towards anything that isn't necessarily air quotes jiu-jitsu. So back in the day, you wouldn't do a lot of things because it's we don't do that. That's not our stuff. Right. And leg locks was one of those. And again, this is one of the reasons why, again, imagine if let's say the IBJJF had been the governing body of an Olympic jiu-jitsu, right? You probably wouldn't have had the heel hooks come into it because they'd be like, no heel hooks. But because we had so many other organizations stealing market share from the IBJJF, they're like, okay, we got to put heel hooks in there. Brown belts, black belts, you guys can do heel hooks now. So we get the pressure, and everybody's being competitive with each other, which is good. But leg locks, and basically, I think our sport became more open to saying, like, you know what, if it works, it works, and I'm going to try it. Because I remember when I first started, there was a lot of this, don't do that because that's wrong or that's not what we do. Even like leg locks. I remember our coach would show us how to do leg locks, but if you did them in a competition, it was almost like, what, you couldn't pass the guard. You had to do an ankle lock. Whereas now it's like we've all become like what I call technical mercenaries. We just like whatever technique works, we're taking it, we're bringing it in. It doesn't matter what sport it's from. We're just going to use it, and it works, and it works.
Yeah, and I think that's like the big one in my mind is not necessarily the leg locks, but the openness of accepting new things. Like just being very open-minded about jiu-jitsu in general. Leg locks is one thing, but wrist locks was another one. It's like forbidden. Don't touch my wrist. Like, what do you mean? You can't do armbar? You have to wrist lock me? Like,
you dirty wrist locker.
Right, dirty wrist locker, right? I mean, and now it's like one of my favorites right there, right? But it's just the openness of accepting new ideas, experimenting, just continuous evolution. I think that's the most beautiful part. What we are experiencing today, and many, don't know what we are talking about. Many of them like, what are you guys are talking about? You couldn't do wrist locks, you couldn't do leg locks. Like, what kind of jiu-jitsu is this? But that's how it was 20 years ago, right?
Well, you could do them, but like it was like you just weren't supposed to. Like I remember going to tournaments, and a lot of times there weren't really like restrictive rules. Like I remember going to tournaments where heel hooks were legal for white belts, but it was just nobody did them because it was almost like it was like like, for instance, and again, I'm using certain language here, so for ladies maybe I apologize, but it wasn't considered like manly to go for the ankle lock. You're not being a real man if you don't pass the guard and go for like a kimura or upper body lock. You had to pull. It was always considered like you go for the ankle lock or the heel hook if it's like a Hail Mary and you're losing the match or something, but you should always try to pass the guard and go for jiu-jitsu dominance and that sort of thing. And
it was almost like view non-technical jiu-jitsu. It was like, you don't know jiu-jitsu, so you're going for that stuff. Like almost.
Was it considered cheating in a way within the rules set?
Maybe.
It was considered just like wrist locks. That's kind of dirty.
Like dirty. Yeah. Dirty. Yeah.
But, and I think that, and I don't know, but I think it stems from, there was a famous sort of like team duel with like Luis Fada and his students and Eliot Gracie and his students. And apparently from what I read, the Fada students, like they were leg locking everybody. And so it was like in sort of like, they kind of were like, these techniques, these dirty techniques these kids are doing, these leg lock techniques. It almost, they gave it like a different spin from what I read. And that stuck with us. And even now we all joke about dirty wrist locker, and people will say, is it dirty to wrist lock? It's like, no, it's just something it's this holdover from like the early 2000s.
I tell everybody it is. Yeah, it is. Don't do it.
But that's the beautiful part behind all of this. And I'm really looking forward to the next years ahead of us to see how all of this will change as we continue going, as this sport continues growing, because I think it's the best is ahead of us, at least the way I look at it. Nick, we've been at this for, over an hour at this point. Before we start wrapping this up, one item that we do at the end of each episode with every guest is that our previous guest who was sitting in your seat asked a question not knowing it will be you. Gary's going to take a lead on this. This will be interesting.
So I think this is the first one where the guest, like, he knew. He figured it out. He was pretty confident. So Eliot Marshall, who you're familiar with,
Yeah, I like Eliot, yeah.
Yeah, we'll see if you still like him. Eliot asked, if there was no internet, what would you be doing?
I'd be probably doing the same stuff that I've been doing. Well, to be honest, if there was no internet, I would still if I knew what I knew now, then I would still be running a gym. We would just be doing like mailing ads instead of doing them online ads to bring in students, right? Because obviously before the internet, you still had business and people were still going into places and into establishments. The way that you would do that was different. You had to actually send out mailers and ink and paper. So I'd still be doing what I was doing. If I wasn't this internet guy thing that people, that's okay, because that's not really who I am anyway. Like my day-to-day is a coach. Like I'm in the gym with my students, and that's what I'm actually focused on. The internet stuff that I do is always just kind of fun. You know, I enjoy doing it, but it's not it's not like all my eggs are in that particular basket. And so if there was no internet, then I would be teaching my students and doing all that stuff that I was doing before anybody knew who I was on the internet. It would be basically the same stuff, because that's what I like doing. Yeah, and it just wouldn't be the jiu-jitsu thing.
Yeah, So I feel like you're becoming unique in the online era, because you are coaching when you're doing your videos. You are talking to students when you're doing your videos. It's not about you. You know what I mean? It's not about look at me, look how flashy I am, look what I can do. It's always about how can I help you? What can I answer? Right?
Sure.
You know. So I don't know where I'm going with this, other than I guess to say thank you for that, because I think it gives beginners, intermediate people, someplace to go to get real information and feel like they belong, rather than I'll never be that guy or being talked down to. There's somebody I know of that I think is super disrespectful to lower ranks, and I don't see a place for that. Where
like
I feel
online or
yeah, and stuff he puts out there, and I think that as you know what the social media is now, and it could be very easy for a lot of people to go in that direction, right? To be to making it about themselves, which I don't think you do, and I think that really helps push the good aspects of jiu-jitsu along.
Well, I think that, for me, like you guys just talking about my story, I started off as an overweight kid who had no confidence, that was like petrified to walk down the street because he'd gotten jumped from people. And when I got into wrestling, I absolutely sucked. I mean, I wasn't good at it. I liked being in there, but I was no good at it. And I didn't think I was going to be good at it, but I remember I had encouraging coaches that would, they were always ragging on me, messing with me in a good way, but they were encouraging and they helped me up. And it was like those people just helping me out a little bit changed my life. Right. And I think about a lot of us, if we come into contact with someone who essentially we're all on our own little journeys. Right. And I think of that journey almost like a boat. It's going down this passage of water. And essentially anybody that comes in our life, typically, maybe if they make an impact on us, they nudge us one direction or another, a positive or a negative, just a little bit, just a couple degrees, nothing crazy. But what ends up happening is maybe it doesn't seem like a big deal now, but then all of a sudden 20 years, if you've got going a little bit in a different direction, 20 years later, that's a completely different trajectory. You're in a different place completely than you would have been had you not met that person. And so I think about that, and I can't understand the desire, and I've heard of this from other students, where you would, trash someone who's maybe not very good yet, or maybe they're just new or whatever, because we all started that way at some point. And for me, like I started in such a low place when I got into grappling, and then what it's giving me and the coaches that I've had along the way that have helped me a ton. I just want to continue that on, because I would like to, when I get ready to kick the bucket, be like, say, I pushed a lot of people a couple degrees this way and maybe gave them a slightly better trajectory than they would have had they not come into contact with me, just like the coaches that I came into contact with that gave me a better life because of what they did. And so, I mean, it's simply just passing that on and continuing that. And so that's the hope of what's going on.
Well, and then we do appreciate that, because I think overall jiu-jitsu, it is an amazing sport, impacts millions of people around the world at this point, and we do need positivity around it. There is, what would we bring negative into something that we love? So, more people like you, more people sharing this beautiful art, this beautiful sport, all between each other, and then, let it grow. Let's do some amazing things in the future. As we're wrapping this up, Nick, if anybody has been living under the rock and they don't know who Chewy is, where can Chewy be found? If anybody wants to reach out to you, anybody wants to connect with you, talk about that for a little bit.
You can basically put in Chewjitsu and you can probably find me. So if you're on YouTube, you can put in Chewjitsu and you can find some of my videos. If you're on Instagram, then you can go on Instagram and you can find me there. If you don't really play around with either one of those, I also have a mailing list where I send out a daily email to people about different jiu-jitsu stuff and philosophical ramblings and whatever else you might think. And that's on my website at chewjitsu.net. I would have gotten .com, but it was taken, and I'm sort of in the process of working to secure that domain now from some squatters, but chewjitsu.net. And so yeah, those are the place that you would find me.
Hopefully you won't pay millions of dollars for that.
Not millions, but they're probably going to get me for thousands. So.
They're playing hardball.
Hardball. That's all right. Nick, thank you for being here. Thanks for spending last hour with us, chatting, sharing your journey, sharing your wisdom, sharing your experience. All that is greatly appreciated. And I will be sitting on the sidelines and watching as you continue growing and doing the amazing things that you do.
Hey, brother. Appreciate it. Thank you guys for having me on.
Thank you for listening to RŌL Radio. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to leave us a review and help us make the show even more amazing. For future episodes, check out our website and follow us on all major podcast platforms. Take care.